For days ago, I was pretty sure my landlord barely knew my name. Now he knew exactly how I took my coffee, and somehow that was more terrifying than the flood. I stood barefoot in Grant Whitmore's penthouse kitchen, wearing a borrowed hoodie that was 2 sizes too big and staring at 2 plates of French toast like they contained classified information. Rain crawled down the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him, turning downtown into a watercolor of gray buildings and silver streets. Grant stood at the stove with one hand wrapped around a coffee mug, looking unfairly composed for 7 in the morning. His dark brown hair was still slightly messy from sleep, which felt deeply inappropriate. Landlords were supposed to exist in button-down shirts, holding clipboards and reminding you that rent was due. They were not supposed to make French toast. They definitely were not supposed to remember that you liked cinnamon but hated powdered sugar. "Coffee's getting cold," Grant said. I looked at the mug beside my plate. 2 creams. 1 sugar. Exactly right. This is getting weird. Grant glanced over his shoulder. "Breakfast? You knowing things. You told me yesterday." That sounds suspiciously like listening. The corner of his mouth moved. Barely. Grant Whitmore did not smile like a normal person. He issued tiny facial expressions and expected the rest of us to interpret them. I sat at the marble island and stared at my breakfast. This was morning number 4. For mornings in his penthouse. For mornings of waking up confused about where I was, followed immediately by the smell of coffee and something cooking. For mornings of Grant behaving less like the distant owner of my apartment building and more like someone dangerously close to being thoughtful. The strangest part was that before the flood, Grant and I had probably exchanged 50 words total. Most of them had been things like "morning," "package downstairs," and one memorable, "Your bicycle cannot remain in the emergency stairwell." I had privately categorized him as rich landlord who probably sleeps in a suit. Then the storm happened. If I had known that Wednesday night would end with me stranded 30 floors above my ruined apartment, wearing Grant Whitmore's clothes and wondering why he had made me breakfast again, I might have handled the beginning differently. I might have saved something useful. My passport. My external hard drive. The framed photograph of my parents sitting beside my desk. Instead, when water first started dripping through my ceiling, I saved a houseplant named Kevin. In my defense, Kevin had been with me through 2 jobs, 1 breakup, and a deeply regrettable attempt at cutting my own bangs. At 8:47 p.m., I was sitting at my desk finishing a logo design when something cold landed on my forehead. I looked up. Another drop fell. Then another. "No," I whispered. The ceiling answered by dripping directly onto my keyboard. "Absolutely not." I jumped up, grabbed the nearest bowl, and shoved it under the leak. Then a second leak appeared 6 feet away. Then a third. Within 10 minutes, every mixing bowl I owned was on the floor, along with a stock pot, a salad spinner, and 1 large plastic container that had previously held Christmas decorations. Outside, rain hammered the windows so hard I could barely see the building across the street. Then the hallway alarm started ringing, and someone pounded on my door. I opened it expecting my neighbor. Instead, Grant Whitmore stood there soaked from the storm, breathing hard, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. He looked past me at the growing puddles, then directly into my eyes. "Ethan," he said, "grab what you need. You're coming upstairs with me." And that was the moment my week stopped making any sense. For 3 full seconds, I just stared at Grant like he had announced we were evacuating to the moon. "Upstairs," I repeated. "To your place?" Grant looked at the water spreading across my floor, then back at me. "Unless you have a better dry apartment hidden somewhere." Fair point. I grabbed my backpack and immediately forgot how priorities worked. Laptop, phone charger, wallet, Kevin the houseplant, 3 clean shirts, 1 sock. Why 1 sock? Nobody knows. Panic Ethan was apparently preparing for an emergency in which 1 foot remained permanently uncovered. Grant watched me stuff everything into the bag without comment until I reached for a ceramic coffee mug. "Ethan, it has sentimental value. It says world's okayest designer." "Exactly." Another alarm sounded somewhere downstairs. Grant held out his hand. "Backpack. I can carry it." "And the plant." I looked at Kevin. Grant looked at Kevin. He has been through a lot. Grant closed his eyes for 1 second, like he was asking the universe for patience. Then he took my backpack. "Bring Kevin." We stepped into the hallway, where several neighbors were already heading toward the elevators with overnight bags. Building staff directed everyone away from the lower floors while Grant stopped twice to answer questions. That surprised me. He knew Mrs. Patterson in 1208 needed help contacting her daughter. He remembered that Mr. Bell kept medication refrigerated. He asked a staff member to check on the couple with the newborn on 11. This was not the Grant I knew. My Grant, meaning my landlord Grant, not my Grant in any other deeply embarrassing interpretation, communicated mostly through polite emails and perfectly timed rent statements. This man was calm, attentive, and somehow remembered everybody. By the time we reached the private elevator, my assumptions about him had developed structural damage of their own. The doors opened directly into the penthouse, and I stopped walking. Wow. Grant set my backpack down. What? Nothing. I am just realizing my rent has been financing extremely nice countertops. That tiny almost smile appeared again. Your rent does not cover one countertop. Great. Somehow that makes me feel poorer. The penthouse was enormous, but not flashy. Pale wood floors, cream walls, tall windows, clean furniture, almost no decoration. It looked less like somebody lived there and more like a luxury rental waiting for photographs. No family pictures. No clutter. No abandoned mail. Nothing personal except a stack of books beside the couch and an old wooden bowl near the entryway filled with keys. Grant pointed down the hall. Guest room is the second door. Bathroom is across from it. Towels are in the cabinet. You have a guest room? I have 3. Of course you do. I looked down at my soaked jeans. Water dripped from my jacket onto his immaculate floor. I am ruining your penthouse. It is water, Ethan. The floor will survive. He disappeared into another room and returned with a dark green hoodie and gray sweatpants folded over one arm. These should fit well enough. I took them, suddenly quieter. Thanks. You are welcome. There was no impatience in his voice. No landlord professionalism. Just warmth I had never noticed before. 20 minutes later, I emerged wearing clothes that were definitely too large and found Grant in the kitchen making tea. He had changed too. The crisp button-down shirt was gone. So were the dress shoes. He was wearing a plain navy shirt, soft lounge pants, and absolutely no sign of the intimidating property owner I had spent 11 months avoiding in the lobby. I stopped. Grant glanced up. Everything okay? Yes. Too fast. I cleared my throat. I just did not know landlords owned comfortable clothes. This time, he actually smiled. It changed his whole face. Try to contain your disappointment. He slid a mug toward me. Outside, rain streaked across the windows, 30 floors above a city disappearing beneath the storm. I wrapped both hands around the warm mug. So, I guess I will stay here tonight. Grant looked toward the windows, then at his phone. About that. My stomach dropped. What? They are closing the street, and maintenance cannot inspect your apartment until the water recedes. He paused. Ethan, this might be more than one night. More than one night. Turned out to be the kind of phrase that sounded harmless until I woke up Thursday morning and discovered my entire neighborhood had become a collection of temporary ponds. I stood beside Grant's windows with my phone pressed to my ear while a maintenance supervisor explained that water had reached several apartments on my floor and nobody could return until the electrical system was inspected. How long? I asked. There was a pause long enough to ruin my optimism. 2 or 3 days, minimum. I thanked him, ended the call, and stared at Kevin sitting proudly on Grant's windowsill like he had personally arranged this. Vacation. Congratulations, I told the plant. You live in a penthouse now. Talking to the plant already? Grant's voice came from behind me. I turned and nearly dropped my phone. He was standing in the kitchen with a coffee mug, wearing the same navy shirt from last night, his hair slightly messy. Apparently morning Grant was even less landlord-shaped than evening Grant. This information was unnecessary and therefore immediately stored by my brain forever. Kevin is processing displacement trauma. Grant looked at the plant. Kevin, please do not judge his name. I was going to say he seems resilient. I narrowed my eyes. Are you making fun of my plant? I would never. There it was again, that almost smile. Dangerous. I explained what maintenance had said. Grant listened without interrupting, then nodded toward the hallway. Stay as long as you need. I blinked. That was suspiciously easy. Would you prefer paperwork? Honestly, yes. Paperwork would restore the natural order between landlord and tenant. Grant took a sip of coffee. I can prepare a 40-page temporary residency agreement. Perfect. Make sure there is a section banning emotional attachment to luxury countertops. His laugh was quiet, but real, and for some reason that made me forget my next joke. The rest of the morning became a strange exercise in learning how another person occupied space. Grant worked from a small office near the windows. I set up my laptop at the dining table. He liked silence. I apparently made tiny frustrated noises while designing logos. I learned this because around 11, Grant appeared beside me and asked, "Is the computer upsetting you?" The computer knows what it did. He set a fresh coffee beside my elbow and walked away before I could thank him. At noon, he disappeared downstairs to check on residents who had stayed in the building. When he returned, he carried grocery bags and looked tired in a way I had never seen before. I helped unload them. Bread, eggs, pasta, apples, coffee, normal food. I expected richer groceries, I said. What does that mean? I do not know. Tiny vegetables with impressive resumes. Grant stared at me for 2 seconds. You think I eat differently because I own a building? I thought you had someone whose entire job was choosing your oranges. His name is Carl. He is on vacation. I froze. Grant kept a perfectly straight face. You have an orange guy? He lasted 3 seconds before laughing. You are terrible, I said, pointing an apple at him. You believed me. Because you have 3 guest rooms. That evening, the rain softened, but the city remained gray and waterlogged. Grant cooked pasta while I dried dishes, and the whole thing felt disturbingly ordinary. Comfortable, even. That was the problem. I had spent almost a year thinking Grant Whitmore was distant, humorless, and possibly manufactured in a corporate office. After 24 hours upstairs, I knew he drank his coffee black, hated television news, secretly made terrible jokes, and checked on elderly tenants personally during emergencies. Then my phone buzzed with another update. I read it twice. Grant noticed my expression. What happened? I looked up. Maintenance says my apartment could be inaccessible through the weekend. Silence. Then Grant opened a cabinet and calmly took out a second dinner plate. Okay, he said. Then you are here through the weekend. He said it like the decision required no thought at all. And that was when I realized something inconvenient. The storm was starting to move away. My real problem was only beginning. By Friday morning, I had learned 3 things about Grant Whitmore that felt strangely important. First, he woke up before 6 even when he had nowhere to be. Second, he could cook without turning the kitchen into a disaster zone, which I considered suspicious behavior. Third, he always made enough for 2 people now. I walked into the kitchen wearing his green hoodie and found scrambled eggs, toast, and 2 mugs of coffee waiting on the island. You know there is cereal in the cabinet, right? I asked. Grant glanced up from his phone. I am aware. Then why are you cooking? Because I wanted eggs. I pointed at the second plate. Did the eggs also request a companion? Grant looked at the plate, then at me. Eat your breakfast, Ethan. I sat down before my mouth. Could create a new problem. This was becoming a routine, and routines were dangerous. Routines made temporary things feel permanent. After breakfast, Grant worked in his office while I claimed the dining table again. Around 10, I heard him on the phone discussing repairs, insurance inspections, and temporary accommodations for several residents. His voice stayed calm through every conversation. No irritation. No dramatic sighing. Just solutions. At 11:30, someone from the front desk called about Mrs. Patterson. Grant immediately stood. Is she okay? I asked. She needs groceries and does not want to bother her daughter. He reached for his jacket. I am taking some downstairs. I can help. Grant paused. You do not have to. Neither do you. Something changed in his expression. Softer. Quieter. All right. We spent the next hour carrying grocery bags through the building, checking on residents, and delivering bottled water. Grant knew everyone. Not just apartment numbers. Names. Pets. Jobs. He knew Mr. Bell liked crossword puzzles and that Mrs. Patterson hated decaffeinated coffee with the intensity of a personal feud. Watching him move from door to door, I felt mildly betrayed by my own assumptions. I had spent 11 months treating this man like a walking rent notice. By early afternoon, we were back upstairs, damp from the lingering drizzle and tired enough that neither of us spoke for several minutes. I dropped onto the couch. Grant disappeared down the hallway and returned with 2 towels. He handed me one. You are getting water everywhere again. It is becoming my signature. Your security deposit is nervous. I stared at him. Was that a landlord joke? No, it absolutely was. He sat at the opposite end of the couch, drying his hair. The distance between us was maybe 4 feet, but suddenly the penthouse felt smaller. Not uncomfortable, just different. I noticed ordinary things. The faint crease beside his eyes when he smiled. The way he rolled his sleeves twice, always exactly twice. The fact that he looked exhausted but had still spent his morning helping people. I looked away before my brain could become poetic about my landlord. What? Grant asked. Nothing. You were staring. I was thinking. At my face. Unfortunately, your face was in the general direction of my thoughts. Grant laughed, and warmth climbed into my cheeks. I stood immediately. I am going to make coffee. You have had 3 cups. I am experiencing an emergency. In the kitchen, I grabbed my phone and called Mason, my best friend, and the person least qualified to provide responsible emotional guidance. He answered on the second ring. Are you still trapped with Mr. Penthouse? Keep your voice down. Why? Is your handsome landlord nearby? He is not handsome. Silence. Ethan. I lowered my voice. Fine. He is objectively, annoyingly attractive. But that is irrelevant. You are wearing his clothes, are you not? I looked down at the green hoodie. That proves nothing. You like him. I do not like him. I am temporarily confused because he keeps feeding me and being unexpectedly nice, and apparently my standards are low enough that pancakes could destroy my emotional stability. Mason started laughing. I am serious. If Grant keeps making breakfast, I might accidentally fall in love with my landlord. Mason suddenly stopped laughing. I frowned. What? There was a small sound behind me. I turned around slowly. Grant stood in the kitchen doorway holding 2 empty coffee mugs. His eyebrows were slightly raised. My soul quietly packed a suitcase and left the country. Grant stood perfectly still in the doorway, holding those 2 coffee mugs like he had accidentally walked into a conversation about weather patterns instead of my complete emotional collapse. Mason was still on the phone. I could hear him breathing. The trader was probably smiling. I have to go, I whispered. Is he standing behind you? Mason asked. Goodbye, Mason. Tell Grant I said hello. I ended the call so quickly I nearly launched my phone across the kitchen. Silence settled between us. Long, terrible, expensive penthouse silence. Grant looked at me. I looked at Grant. Kevin sat on the windowsill contributing absolutely nothing. So, I said finally, how much of that did you hear? Grant walked toward the sink and placed the mugs beside it. Enough. That is not a measurement. The important part. My stomach dropped through approximately 30 floors. There was no important part. You said I was attractive. Objectively. Annoyingly attractive. That was criticism. Grant turned toward me, and there was unmistakable amusement in his eyes. And something about pancakes destroying your emotional stability. You are taking everything wildly out of context. What was the context? I opened my mouth. Nothing arrived. My brain had apparently resigned without notice. The context was breakfast. Grant nodded slowly. Dangerous subject. Extremely. I grabbed the coffee container and pretended to study the label because looking directly at him had become medically impossible. For the record, I am not falling in love with you. I did not say you were. Good. You said it. I closed my eyes. Grant. He laughed quietly. I am sorry. You do not sound sorry. I am trying. Try harder. I heard him move closer, then stop several feet away. When I finally looked up, the teasing had faded from his expression. Ethan, you do not have to be embarrassed. That was somehow worse. Kindness was always worse. I could defend myself against jokes. Kindness walked straight through the front door and rearranged the furniture. I am not embarrassed, I said. I am considering changing my name and moving to Montana, but emotionally I am excellent. Montana seems dramatic. You heard me describe your face to my best friend. You said I was attractive. I will recover. I also implied your cooking could compromise my judgment. That part concerns me more. A laugh escaped before I could stop it. Grant smiled, and just like that, the pressure in my chest loosened. He reached past me for the coffee, careful not to crowd me. Do you want another cup? Apparently, I am already making terrible decisions, so yes. He poured one and added cream. Then sugar. Exactly the way I liked it. I stared at the mug when he handed it over. You remembered. Grant shrugged. You drink it the same way every morning. Every morning. 2 ordinary words. They should not have meant anything. Somehow, standing therein. His borrowed hoodie with rain whispering against the windows, they did. The rest of Friday passed without disaster. Mostly. Grant returned to work. I finished 2 client projects and managed to avoid calling Mason again because friendship had consequences. By evening, the clouds had finally begun breaking apart over the city. Grant ordered pizza, and we ate at the kitchen island while arguing about whether pineapple belonged anywhere near cheese. He was against it with unreasonable conviction. I accused him of abusing landlord authority. He threatened to add a fruit policy to my lease. It was easy. Too easy. That frightened me more than the awkward conversation had. Later, before going to bed, I paused outside the guest room. Grant was turning off the kitchen lights. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night." I hesitated. "And Grant?" He looked back. "Thanks for not making today weird." His expression softened. "You did enough of that for both of us." I pointed at him. "There is the terrible landlord again." He smiled. "Sleep well." I went into the guest room and closed the door, smiling despite myself. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee. For one hopeful second, I assumed Friday had been forgotten. Then I walked into the kitchen and stopped. Grant was standing at the stove. A plate waited at my usual seat. On it were 3 blueberry pancakes. He glanced over his shoulder as if nothing unusual had happened. "Morning." I stared at him. "You made pancakes. You mentioned them yesterday." And suddenly, I had a much bigger problem than embarrassment. The pancakes were not helping. That was my first coherent thought as I sat at the kitchen island on Saturday morning, staring at 3 perfectly round blueberry pancakes, while Grant calmly poured coffee like he had not just turned breakfast into an emotional event. "You understand this is suspicious," I said. "The pancakes. The remembering." Grant placed my mug beside the plate. 2 creams. 1 sugar. Again. "You mentioned pancakes yesterday. People mention things all the time. Nobody acts on everything they hear. Maybe people should listen more." That shut me up. I took a bite mostly because chewing gave me an excuse not to answer. They were annoyingly good. "Well?" Grant asked. "Terrible. You have eaten half of one." "I am gathering evidence." His smile appeared slowly. "Take your time." Something about that sentence stayed with me longer than it should have. After breakfast, the morning settled into our increasingly familiar routine. I worked at the dining table while Grant answered emails in his office. Around noon, maintenance called with encouraging news. The water had receded enough for inspections to begin, but my floor still needed electrical testing and repairs. Monday was now the earliest possible return. I expected frustration. Instead, when I told Grant, he simply said, "Okay," and went back to his laptop. "That is it?" I asked. "What else should I say?" "I do not know." Maybe sigh dramatically. "Remind me that I am occupying valuable penthouse territory." Grant looked around the enormous room. "I think we can manage." I smiled before I could stop myself. By late afternoon, sunlight finally broke through the clouds. The whole city changed color. Gray became gold. Wet rooftops reflected the sky, and the windows turned bright enough that I had to squint. I found Grant on the balcony checking a planter that had survived the storm. I stepped outside beside him. The air smelled clean, cool, almost new. "You garden?" I asked. "Barely. That plant looks alive." High praise from Kevin's owner. "Kevin is thriving." Grant leaned against the railing. For once, neither of us rushed to fill the silence. 30 floors below, traffic had started moving again. The city was returning to normal. I should have felt relieved. Instead, something heavy settled in my chest. Normal meant my apartment, my table, my coffee maker. No Grant quietly sliding a mug toward me every morning. I hated that I noticed. "You are quiet," Grant said. "I am capable of silence. I have seen very little evidence." "That is hurtful." He smiled, then looked toward the skyline. "Are you worried about your apartment?" "A little." I rubbed my hands together against the cool air. "Mostly the stuff I could not grab. It is stupid." "It is not. Some of it is replaceable." "Replaceable does not mean meaningless." I looked at him. There was no joke in his expression. "The photograph beside my desk," I said quietly. "It is my parents' road trip to Maine when I was 14. My father spent 20 minutes trying to make the camera timer work." Grant nodded. "He did not tell me it would be fine. He did not offer to replace anything. He just listened." "I hope it survived," he said. For simple words. Somehow, they were exactly right. That evening we ate leftover pizza and watched an old comedy on the couch. Halfway through, the lights flickered once. Then twice. The television went dark. The penthouse fell silent. "Please tell me this building is not about to become an aquarium again," I said. Grant checked his phone. Temporary outage. Storm damage affecting the block. Emergency lights glowed faintly from the hallway. Outside, whole sections of downtown went dark until only scattered windows and distant headlights remained. Grant found 2 battery lanterns and set one beside the couch. Without the television, the room suddenly felt enormous and strangely intimate in its quietness. I sat at one end of the couch. Grant sat closer than usual because the lantern was between us. Our hands reached for it at the same time. His fingers brushed mine. Both of us stopped. It was barely a touch. Nothing really. Except Grant did not move his hand away immediately. Neither did I. Then he looked at me, and for the first time since I had entered his penthouse, I could not think of a single joke. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. My fingertips rested against Grant's beside the lantern, and my brain, usually a dependable supplier of unnecessary commentary, had gone completely silent. Then the emergency light near the hallway blinked, and I remembered basic human functions. "Well," I said, pulling my hand back, "good news. Electricity is apparently responsible for most of my personality." Grant looked down, smiling faintly. I was wondering what happened. "Do not get comfortable. I am rebooting." He shifted the lantern onto the coffee table, leaving the couch washed in soft amber light. Outside the windows, downtown looked almost unreal. Buildings had disappeared into darkness except for scattered emergency lights, and the wet streets reflected passing headlights like thin ribbons of gold. Without the usual glow of the city, the penthouse felt different. Smaller somehow. Quieter. "Does this happen often?" I asked. "People getting stranded in my apartment?" "Power outages." "No," Grant leaned back. "The other thing is also new." I laughed, but the silence returned gently afterward. This time it did not feel awkward. I looked around the room. "Can I ask you something?" "You usually do whether I agree or not." "Fair. Why does this place look like nobody lives here?" Grant glanced around. "I live here. Technically. But there are no pictures. No weird souvenirs. No refrigerator magnets from disappointing vacations. Your home looks like it is waiting for a real estate photographer." He was quiet long enough that I almost apologized. Then he looked toward the dark windows. "My parents moved constantly when I was growing up. Chicago, Boston, Seattle, back to Chicago. My father bought properties, renovated them, sold them. Every house was temporary. So you learn not to unpack." Grant looked at me. "Something like that." The joke I had been preparing disappeared. "How long have you lived here?" 6 years. I stared at the empty walls. "Grant, I know. 6 years is not temporary." Apparently nobody told the walls. I smiled, but there was something sad underneath his words. Suddenly the perfect penthouse made sense. It was not cold because Grant wanted to impress people. It was cold because he had never learned how to make a place stay. "Is that why you managed the building yourself?" I asked. "You could hire someone to handle most of it." Grant rubbed his thumb along the edge of his coffee mug. "My father treated buildings like numbers. Occupancy rates. Market value. Return on investment." He paused. I hated that. I thought about Mrs. Patterson's groceries. Mr. Bell's medication. The couple with the newborn. "So you memorize everybody instead." I try to know who lives under my roof. Under my roof. Something about the phrase warmed the space between us. "You know," I said, "this is extremely inconvenient information." "Why?" "Because I had a very organized opinion of you before Wednesday. Cold landlord. Cold, intimidating landlord. Better. Do not be proud." Grant laughed softly. The sound faded, and our eyes met again. This time neither of us looked away quickly. My heart did something annoyingly noticeable. I focused on the lantern. For what it is worth, this place feels less empty now. Grant's expression changed. Just slightly. "Because Kevin is here?" "Obviously. He brings tremendous emotional depth." "And his owner?" I looked up. Grant was watching me carefully. "No teasing now. His owner is temporary," I said. The words came out quieter than I intended. Grant's gaze dropped for a moment. "Right." The lights suddenly returned, flooding the room with brightness. I blinked. The refrigerator hummed back to life. Somewhere in the building, an alarm chirped once and stopped. Everything was normal again. Except it was not. Grant stood and picked up the lantern. "I should put this away." "Sure." I watched him cross the room, feeling like something important had almost happened without either of us knowing what to call it. The next morning, I woke early and found Grant already in the kitchen. There were blueberry pancakes again. 2 mugs. 2 plates. He handed me my coffee before I asked. 2 creams, 1 sugar, he said. I smiled. You are getting dangerously good at this. Grant looked at me over the rim of his mug. I have had practice. I started to answer, but something stopped me. Practice? He seemed to realize what he had said. Making coffee. No, I set my mug down. You knew how I took it the first morning. Grant went still. A tiny detail clicked into place. Then another. Grant, I said slowly, how did you know? Grant did not answer immediately, which was unfortunate because silence gave my imagination room to start a small investigation agency. I stared at him across the kitchen island. He stared at his coffee. Grant, I repeated, it is not complicated. That is exactly what people say before explaining something complicated. He exhaled and set his mug down. There is a coffee shop across from the building. I know. I spend enough money there to qualify as an investor. You go most mornings around 8:15. I blinked. You know when I get coffee? I leave for work around the same time. Okay. That was reasonable. Mostly. But knowing my schedule does not explain 2 creams and 1 sugar. Grant looked mildly uncomfortable, which was new enough to distract me. I have been behind you in line. Once. More than once. How many times? Ethan, that is not a number. His mouth twitched. Several. I leaned back. Suddenly little memories began resurfacing. Grant holding the lobby door while I carried coffee and my laptop. Grant standing near the mailboxes while I complained to Mason about a client. Grant stepping aside so Mrs. Patterson could enter the elevator first. He had always been there, somewhere at the edge of my routine. I had simply assumed he was not paying attention. You remember my coffee because you heard me order it? Yes. That is weirdly specific. You are memorable. The words landed softly. No dramatic music. No lightning outside. Just 4 syllables and my entire brain forgetting its job. I am sorry, what? Grant looked away toward the windows. You talk to everyone. That sounds like a polite way of saying I never stop talking. You remember the front desk staff's birthdays. You carry Mrs. Patterson's groceries when you see her. You leave ridiculous notes on packages when Mason visits. I narrowed my eyes. You saw the note about the raccoon? Everyone saw the note about the raccoon. That was private correspondence. Grant smiled, but I was still processing. What else do you know? I asked. His expression became careful. You work late on Thursdays. You order Thai food when you have deadlines. You bought Kevin last spring after your breakup. My stomach tightened. How do you know about the breakup? You were in the lobby with Mason. You were upset. I walked past. The warmth in the room suddenly changed. So you have been noticing me for months. Yes. Why? Grant went quiet again. I hated how much that silence mattered. Because I noticed you, he finally said. That is circular logic. It is the truth. I searched his face. Grant, were you keeping track of me? His eyebrows lifted. No, absolutely not. His answer came quickly, firmly. I never checked cameras, records, or anything private. Everything I know came from ordinary moments in shared spaces. I kept my distance on purpose. Why? He looked directly at me then. Because I am your landlord. There it was. Simple. Heavy. I did not want friendliness from me to feel like something you had to return, he continued. You live in a building I own. That creates a line. I looked down at my coffee. Suddenly his old distance did not seem cold anymore. It seemed careful. So all those months when I thought you disliked me, I never disliked you. You barely spoke to me. That was intentional. You are terrible at being approachable. I was not trying to be approachable. I laughed once, mostly because my chest felt too full. Grant's expression softened. Then the flood happened, and you needed somewhere safe to stay. The line became harder to ignore. I looked at the 2 plates between us, the pancakes, the coffee he had remembered long before I knew he remembered anything. And breakfast? I asked. Grant held my gaze for a long moment. Breakfast is breakfast. Coward. His smile appeared, small and helpless. Probably. My phone rang before I could answer. Maintenance. I picked up, listened, and felt the strange warmth inside me disappear 1 degree at a time. When the call ended, Grant was watching me. What did they say? I swallowed. My apartment passed inspection. I looked toward the guest room where my backpack waited. I can go home tomorrow. The rest of Sunday should have felt like good news. My apartment was safe. The electricity worked. Maintenance had cleared the floor. I could return to my own bed, my own coffee maker, and whatever possessions had survived the week. Instead, I spent the afternoon wandering around Grant's penthouse feeling like someone had quietly moved all the furniture inside my head. Grant behaved normally, which was deeply inconsiderate. He answered emails. He checked repair updates. He made sandwiches for lunch. He even asked whether I needed boxes to carry anything downstairs. Boxes. Nothing says romance like. Industrial cardboard. I have one backpack, I reminded him. And Kevin. Grant glanced toward the plant. Kevin deserves his own transportation. Finally, some respect. We smiled, but the moment faded too quickly. By evening, I had folded Grant's borrowed clothes and placed them on the guest bed. The green hoodie sat on top. I stared at it longer than any emotionally stable adult should stare at cotton. It had been the first thing he gave me when I arrived soaked and overwhelmed. Now returning it felt strangely official. Temporary guest. Temporary clothes. Temporary breakfast. Temporary everything. I hated the word temporary. Dinner was quieter than usual. Grant made chicken and rice. I tried 3 separate jokes about his seasoning choices, and all 3 landed somewhere between mildly amusing and please stop talking. Eventually I gave up. You are quiet, Grant said. That accusation feels hypocritical coming from you. You are usually louder. Maybe I am maturing. In one afternoon, growth can be sudden. Grant studied me across the island. Are you worried about going back? There it was again. His irritating ability to ask the question underneath the question. I should be excited. That was not what I asked. I moved a piece of rice around my plate. It is going to be weird. The apartment. Everything. He waited. Grant was good at waiting. It made lying difficult. A week ago, I barely knew you, I said. Now I know you hate pineapple. Alphabetize the books in your office, and pretend not to care when Kevin leans toward the window because you secretly rotate his pot every afternoon. Grant looked toward the plant. He needs even sunlight. You have bonded with him. Admit it. Never. I smiled, then looked down again. And tomorrow I go downstairs, and everything goes back to normal. Grant was silent. Normal is good, he said eventually. The words should not have hurt. They did. Right, I said. Obviously. After dinner, I washed the dishes while Grant dried them. Our hands brushed once when I passed him a plate. This time we both moved away immediately. Message received. I went to bed early and slept badly. Monday morning arrived with bright sunlight and the sound of traffic returning to the street below. I lay in the guest bed for several minutes, listening for familiar sounds from the kitchen. Cabinet doors. A pan on the stove. The coffee grinder. Nothing. I finally got up and walked down the hallway. The kitchen was empty. No pancakes. No eggs. No second plate. One coffee mug sat beside the machine. Mine. 2 creams, 1 sugar. Grant stood by the windows already dressed for work in a charcoal suit. Every inch the distant landlord I remembered from before the storm. Morning, he said. Morning. I looked at the empty stove. Ridiculous disappointment settled in my stomach. No breakfast. Grant adjusted his watch. I have an early meeting. Of course. I picked up the coffee. It was exactly right, which somehow made everything worse. Grant nodded toward my backpack near the entryway. I can help you take your things downstairs before I leave. I can manage. Ethan. Really? It is fine. The phrase sounded false even to me. Grant seemed like he wanted to say something, but he only nodded. All right. 20 minutes later, I stood beside the private elevator with my backpack over one shoulder and Kevin tucked against my chest. Grant handed me the green hoodie. You forgot this. I looked at it. It is yours. Keep it. Why? His eyes met mine. It looks better on you. My heart stumbled over itself. Then the elevator doors opened, ruining any chance of intelligent conversation. I stepped inside. Grant stayed in the penthouse. Neither of us moved toward the other. Thank you, I said. For everything. You are welcome, Ethan. The doors began closing. For 1 second, I almost stopped them. I almost asked the question sitting between us. Instead, I watched Grant disappear behind 2 sliding panels of polished metal. As the elevator descended, I realized going back to my apartment did not feel like going home. It felt like leaving one. My apartment smelled like damp drywall, lemon cleaner, and disappointment. Maintenance had done what they could, and nothing important was structurally damaged, but the place felt different. The rug was gone. 2 shelves had been moved. My desk sat 3 feet from where it belonged, which should not have bothered me nearly as much as it did. I set Kevin on the windowsill and dropped my backpack beside the couch. Home, I announced. Kevin offered no opinion. Exactly. I spent the next hour inspecting everything I had left behind. Most of my clothes were fine. My external hard drive still worked. The world's okayest designer mug had survived, proving that miracles apparently came with terrible typography. Then I reached the desk. The framed photograph of my parents was face down behind a stack of books. My stomach tightened. I picked it up carefully. The frame was stained along one edge, but the photograph inside was dry. There we were in Maine, 14-year-old me squinting at the camera, while my mother laughed and my father looked proud of finally defeating the timer. I sat down. For several seconds, I just held it. My first instinct was to tell Grant. That realization hit harder than it should have. I reached for my phone, opened his contact, and typed. The picture survived. I stared at the message. Then I deleted it. Excellent, I told Kevin. We are emotionally healthy adults now. By noon, I had unpacked everything. By 1, I had reorganized the kitchen. By 2, I had discovered that silence was apparently much louder when nobody was upstairs making terrible landlord jokes. I tried working. I lasted 17 minutes. I made coffee. It tasted wrong. Same beans. Same cream. Same sugar. Wrong. This is ridiculous. My phone buzzed. Mason. I answered immediately. I am having a crisis. You have been home for 4 hours. Exactly. Plenty of time for a crisis. You miss him. I miss functional countertops. Ethan. And breakfast. Ethan. And maybe his face, but only because I became accustomed to seeing it. Mason sighed. Did either of you actually say what was happening? We discussed coffee. That is not what I asked. I collapsed onto the couch. He kept his distance because he is my landlord. He did not want me to feel pressured. Mason went quiet. That is actually thoughtful. I know. It is awful. Why awful? Because it would be easier if you were secretly terrible. Mason laughed. So, what are you going to do? I looked toward the ceiling as if I could somehow see through 30 floors. Nothing. That sounds unlike you. I am respecting boundaries. You once argued with a parking meter for 10 minutes. It started it. After we hung up, I tried again to work. At 5:30, there was a knock at my door. My heart reacted before my brain could intervene. I opened it. Grant stood in the hallway, still wearing his charcoal suit, holding a small cardboard box. Hi, he said. Hi. He lifted the box slightly. Maintenance found these behind the cabinet in your kitchen. Inside were 2 notebooks, a set of measuring spoons, and a little ceramic lighthouse my mother had bought in Maine. Oh, my voice softened. Thank you. I thought you would want them. I do. Neither of us moved. The hallway suddenly felt very narrow. The photograph survived too, I said. Grant's expression warmed immediately. Good. One word. Exactly the reaction I had wanted all afternoon. Do you want to come in? I asked. Grant hesitated. I should probably let you settle. There it was again. The careful distance. This time it irritated me. You keep doing that. Doing what? Deciding what I need before I get to decide. Grant frowned. Ethan, I am trying to give you space. What if I do not want space? Silence. His eyes stayed on mine. I could hear the elevator humming somewhere down the hall. You are my landlord, I continued. I understand that. I understand why you were careful. But I am standing in my own apartment now. You are not offering me shelter. I am not depending on you tonight. So if I ask you to come inside, that is me asking. Grant's expression changed, but he still did not move. And if I want to stay? He asked quietly. My heartbeat stumbled. Then maybe stop making every choice for both of us. For the first time since the storm, Grant looked genuinely uncertain. Then he stepped across the doorway. Just one step. But it felt like something enormous had shifted. I closed the door behind him and realized the flood had forced me into his home. This was the first time either of us had chosen to enter the other's. Grant stood inside my apartment like a man who had crossed an invisible border and was waiting to see whether alarms would go off. I set the cardboard box on the kitchen counter and turned toward him. You can relax. I am relaxed. Your shoulders disagree. He looked down at himself as if his shoulders had betrayed confidential information. I am trying to be careful. I know. That is the problem. Grant's expression tightened slightly. Being careful is a problem? When you use it to avoid saying what you actually want, yes. Silence settled between us. I had spent months believing Grant was impossible to read. Now I was beginning to understand that he was not unreadable. He was restrained. There was a difference. I leaned against the counter. You noticed me before the storm. Yes. You remembered my coffee. Yes. You made breakfast every morning. You needed breakfast. I stared at him. That answer deserves a fine. I own the building. Then I will report you to yourself. A reluctant smile touched his face, but I did not let him escape into humor. Grant, why did you stop this morning? His smile disappeared. He looked toward the window. Because you were going home. That explains why I left. It does not explain the empty stove. He exhaled slowly. Because I needed to remember what the situation was. Which was, you were staying with me because you had no other place to stay. His voice was calm, but his hands were not. He kept adjusting the cuff of his shirt. I liked having you there, Ethan. More than I should have allowed myself to. My heart gave one hard, ridiculous beat. Allowed yourself? You were dependent on me for somewhere to sleep. I own your apartment. I did not want you wondering whether saying no to me could affect your home. Every joke in my head disappeared. So you pulled away. I thought it was the right thing. And now, Grant finally looked at me. Now you are back in your apartment. You are safe. You do not need anything from me. He paused. That changes things. You are still my landlord. Which is why I am not going to ask you for anything unless you make it very clear that you want the same thing. There it was. Not a confession exactly. More like a door left open. My turn to walk through it. Okay, I said. I want you to stay for coffee. Grant blinked. Coffee. Do not look disappointed. We are starting small. I am not disappointed. Your face disagrees. That earned a real laugh. The tension broke just enough for me to breathe again. I turned toward the coffee maker. Sit down. Prepare yourself for disappointment. My coffee is significantly worse than yours. I already know. I looked over my shoulder. Excuse me. You buy inexpensive beans. Get out of my home. Grant laughed again and sat at my tiny kitchen table. It was almost comical seeing him there after a week in his enormous penthouse. His knees barely fit beneath it. Kevin occupied the windowsill beside him like a judgmental chaperone. I made 2 mugs and carried them over. Grant took 1 sip. His eyebrows moved. Do not say it. I said nothing. Your eyebrows are insulting me. They are expressive. They are elitist. We talked for almost 2 hours. Not about repairs. Not about leases. About ordinary things. My work. His childhood. Mason. The places we wanted to travel. The terrible haircut I gave myself during college. Grant admitted he had once tried to bake bread and produced something he described as construction material. By the time the sky outside turned orange, my apartment no longer felt empty. Grant stood reluctantly. I should go. I walked him to the door. Probably. Neither of us sounded convinced. His hand rested on the doorknob. Ethan. Yeah. For what it is worth, breakfast was never an obligation. I went very still. Grant's voice softened. I made it because I liked knowing you would walk into the kitchen. Then he opened the door and left before my brain could produce a response. I stood there staring at the empty hallway. Behind me, my kitchen was quiet. I looked at the coffee mugs on the table, then at the clock. 7:12 in the evening. Breakfast was approximately 12 hours away. Suddenly, 12 hours felt completely unreasonable. I made it until 6:23 the next morning before accepting that I was not going to behave like a normal person. I had been awake since 5:40, staring at the ceiling while Grant's words replayed in my head with the persistence of a song I could not turn off. He liked knowing I would walk into the kitchen. That sentence had ruined sleep, logic, and possibly my future ability to view breakfast as a neutral meal. At 6:30, I gave up. This is not impulsive, I told Kevin while pulling on Grant's green hoodie. This is decisive. Kevin remained skeptical. 10 minutes later, I was standing in a 24-hour grocery store holding blueberries, pancake mix, maple syrup, eggs, and coffee beans that cost significantly more than my usual brand. Do not judge me, I told the cashier. She had not said anything. By 7:15, I was riding the elevator upstairs with 2 grocery bags and enough nervous energy to power the building. The doors opened into the private hallway outside Grant's penthouse. For the first time, I was not arriving because of rain, repairs, or an emergency. I was there because I wanted to be. Somehow that made knocking harder. I knocked anyway. Footsteps approached. The door opened. Grant stood there in a gray sweater and lounge pants, his hair still untidy from sleep. He looked at me, then at the grocery bags, then back at me. Ethan, good morning. Is something wrong? That depends on your opinion of pancakes. He stared at me. You came upstairs at 7:20 in the morning to ask about pancakes. I brought evidence. I lifted the bags. Grant's expression softened, but he did not immediately step aside. Careful. Still careful. So I made the choice unmistakable. You made breakfast all week, I said. My turn. Something warm moved across his face. He opened the door wider. Come in. The penthouse looked exactly as I had left it, yet stepping inside felt completely different. I carried the groceries to the kitchen and started unpacking. Grant leaned against the island watching me. You bought expensive coffee. Apparently, I have been bullied into developing standards. I never bullied you. Your eyebrows did. He laughed. My hands were shaking slightly as I opened the pancake mix. Grant noticed. Of course he noticed. Ethan, do not. You are nervous. I am handling flour before 8 in the morning. Anyone would be nervous. He came around the island, but stopped several feet away. You do not have to prove anything. I put the measuring cup down. I know. Then I turned toward him. That is why I am here. The humor disappeared between us, leaving something quieter. Yesterday you said you did not want me wondering whether I had a choice. I continued. So I went home. I slept in my own apartment. I woke up there. Nobody asked me to come back. Grant watched me without moving. And I came back anyway. His breath left slowly. Ethan, I like you, Grant. There. No joke. No escape route. Not because you own the building. Not because you gave me somewhere to stay. Not because your pancakes are annoyingly good. His mouth twitched. Although they are. Thank you. Do not interrupt my emotional breakthrough. Sorry. I stepped closer. I like the man who remembers Mrs. Patterson's groceries. The man who rotates Kevin toward the sunlight. The man who listened when I talked about my parents instead of trying to fix everything. Grant's eyes softened. I like you too. That is convenient. He laughed under his breath. More than is convenient. We stood there smiling like two people who had spent an entire week making something simple unnecessarily complicated. Then Grant lifted one hand, stopped, and asked quietly, Can I kiss you? My answer came easily. Yes. The kiss was gentle and brief, warm enough to make my nervousness disappear without turning the moment into anything it did not need to be. When we stepped apart, I was still smiling. Grant looked toward the counter. Your pancake batter is getting lumpy. I stared at him. I confess my feelings, and you criticize my batter? I am protecting breakfast. Unbelievable. I turned back to the bowl. A second later, Grant stood beside me, shoulder lightly touching mine as he reached for the whisk. This time, neither of us moved away. 3 months later, Kevin had officially moved upstairs before I had. This was not my decision. Grant claimed the penthouse windows provided better morning light, which was technically true, but I suspected. He had simply stolen my plant and developed an elaborate botanical defense. He likes it here, Grant said whenever I complained. He is a plant. He likes windows. Exactly. That is not evidence of preference. Kevin remained on the kitchen windowsill, thriving under suspicious circumstances. I still kept my apartment downstairs. That mattered to both of us in the beginning. We wanted whatever happened between us to be something we chose slowly, not something created by an emergency. So we dated like normal people, or at least our version of normal. We went to a neighborhood Italian restaurant where Grant discovered I could not pronounce half the wine list. I dragged him to a street fair where he bought a ridiculous ceramic frog because I said it looked like him. He denied the resemblance. The frog now lived on his bookshelf. Mason met Grant and spent 20 minutes asking questions that sounded suspiciously like an employment interview. Mrs. Patterson figured us out before we told anyone and simply said, "About time," when she saw us sharing an elevator. Apparently subtlety had never been one of my strengths. Grant became less careful in small ways. He started leaving books on the coffee table instead of returning them immediately to the shelf. A framed photograph of us appeared beside the window after our first weekend trip to Maine. The picture showed me laughing while Grant attempted to operate the camera timer. My father would have appreciated the symmetry. I started leaving things upstairs too. A phone charger, running shoes, 2 shirts, then 5. My favorite coffee mug somehow migrated into Grant's cabinet. One evening, I opened a drawer looking for a spoon and found an entire section labeled Ethan in Grant's impossibly organized handwriting. This is how it starts, I told him. How it starts? Domestic annexation. You left 12 different things here this week. Those were diplomatic gifts. Eventually, I stopped counting how many nights I slept upstairs. There was no dramatic moving day. No truck. No grand announcement. My life simply accumulated around his until the penthouse stopped looking like a showroom. There were photographs on the walls now, my sketchbooks on the dining table, Grant's jacket over a chair, Kevin and the ceramic frog occupying opposite windowsills like rival monarchs. The place had become messy in tiny, ordinary ways. It had become ours. On a rainy Saturday morning in early fall, I woke to the sound of water tapping gently against the windows. For half a second, memory pulled me backward. Bowls on the floor, an alarm in the hallway, Grant standing at my door telling me to grab what I needed. Then I smelled coffee and smiled. I walked into the kitchen wearing the same green hoodie he had given me that first night. Grant sat at the island reading something on his tablet. He looked up. Morning. Sit there and prepare to be impressed. His eyebrows rose. Should I be concerned? Always. I started breakfast while he watched with the expression of a man observing an unsupervised science experiment. I made French toast, because some stories deserved symmetry. When I placed 2 plates on the island, Grant looked at his, then at mine. No powdered sugar. I remember things. Apparently. I poured his coffee black and made mine with 2 creams and 1 sugar. Grant reached across the island and took my hand. Such a small gesture. Once, I would have turned it into a joke because jokes were easier than admitting when something mattered. Now I simply held on. Rain moved softly across the windows behind him. You know, I said, when the flood happened, I thought I had the worst luck in the world. Grant smiled. And now, I looked around the kitchen. 2 plates, 2 coffee mugs, photographs on walls that had once been empty, a plant that had betrayed me for better sunlight, a man who had spent years teaching himself not to need permanence. Now holding my hand like staying was the easiest choice he had ever made. Now I think the storm took a few things, I said, but it gave me somewhere I wanted to come back to. Grant squeezed my hand. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, breakfast was getting cold. Neither of us cared.